Godfrey of Bouillon. Godfrey of Bouillon was not the most powerful man on the First Crusade. He was not the wealthiest, not the most politically connected, and not the most experienced military commander in the coalition that marched out of Europe in 1096. He was the Duke of Lower Lorraine, a middling title in the hierarchy of European nobility, surrounded by princes and counts who outranked him in prestige and resources. And yet, when Jerusalem fell on July 15, 1099, after 3 years of marching, starving, fighting, and dying across thousands of miles of hostile territory, it was Godfrey of Bouillon who emerged from the blood and dust as the defining figure of the entire enterprise. The reason begins with what he did before the crusade even started. Godfrey did not simply take the cross and ride east with his treasury intact. He sold it. He mortgaged his castles, liquidated his estates, and converted nearly everything he owned into silver to fund his campaign. The castle of Bouillon itself, the ancestral seat of his family, and the source of his title, was sold to the Prince Bishop of Liège. This was not a tactical decision. There was no plan to recoup these losses through conquest. Godfrey was burning his life down to go to Jerusalem, and the people around him noticed. Contemporary chroniclers, including Albert of Aix, whose Historia Hierosolymitana is one of the major accounts of the First Crusade, describe Godfrey as a man of exceptional piety and physical courage, someone whose personal devotion to the crusading ideal was not a performance but a condition. By the time the crusading army reached Jerusalem in June 1099, it had already survived the horrific siege of Antioch, mass starvation, plague, internal political collapse, and the near-total dissolution of morale at multiple points. The men who made it to the walls of Jerusalem were not an army in any conventional sense. They were the survivors of something that should have killed them. The assault on Jerusalem on July 15th was brutal, chaotic, and ultimately decisive. Godfrey's forces attacked the northern wall using siege towers, and according to multiple accounts, including the Gesta Francorum, one of the earliest eyewitness chronicles of the Crusade, his men were among the first to breach the defenses and fight their way into the city. What followed was a massacre. The Crusaders killed a substantial portion of Jerusalem's Muslim and Jewish population in the hours after the breach, a fact recorded in both Christian and Muslim sources without significant dispute. Godfrey's role in the killing is less clearly documented than his role in the assault itself, but he was present and in command. In the immediate aftermath, with Jerusalem secured and the crusading leaders meeting to decide who would govern the city, the other nobles offered Godfrey the title of King of Jerusalem. His refusal became the most famous moment of his life. He would not, he reportedly said, wear a crown of gold in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. The exact phrasing of this statement varies across the sources, and historians note that we cannot be certain of the precise words, but the refusal itself is historically confirmed. Instead, he accepted the title of Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, a designation that conveyed governing authority without the royal title. This distinction, which might seem like a technicality, was in the medieval context an enormously powerful signal. It read as humility so complete it bordered on the miraculous, and it cemented Godfrey's reputation in Western memory as the purest of the Crusaders. He did not go to Jerusalem for a crown. He went because he believed God required it of him, and he had spent everything he owned to prove it. Within weeks of Jerusalem's fall, he commanded the Crusader forces at the Battle of Ascalon on August 12, 1099, defeating a Fatimid relief army that had marched from Egypt to retake the city. The victory secured the new Crusader kingdom's survival in its most vulnerable first weeks. Then on July 18, 1100, barely a year after the conquest that defined his life, Godfrey of Bouillon died, most likely of typhoid fever. He was buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The brevity of his rule meant he never had to make the compromises, political enemies, and governing failures that complicate every ruler's legacy. He conquered Jerusalem, refused its crown, defended it, and died before the kingdom's problems became his fault. It was, from a purely legendary standpoint, impeccable timing. Conrad III of Germany. Conrad III of Germany was persuaded to go on crusade by the most dangerous preacher in 12th century Europe, and everything that followed confirmed that he should have said no. The Second Crusade was launched in response to the fall of Edessa in 1144. When the county of Edessa, one of the original Crusader states established after the First Crusade, was captured by the Zengid ruler Imad ad-Din Zengi. The shock in Europe was significant. Edessa was the first Crusader territory to fall, and it raised the question of whether the entire project of a Christian presence in the Holy Land was more fragile than anyone had admitted. Pope Eugenius III called for a new crusade, and Bernard of Clairvaux, the Cistercian abbot whose sermons could move entire crowds to weeping and whose theological authority was essentially unmatched in Western Christendom at the time, took it upon himself to recruit the great monarchs of Europe. Conrad III, King of Germany and Holy Roman Emperor-elect, was resistant. He had reasons to stay home. Germany was politically unstable, his rule was contested, and he had already declined the crusade once. Bernard found him at the Diet of Speyer in December 1146, and according to the Chronicle of Odo of Douai, delivered a sermon so precisely aimed at Conrad's personal conscience that it broke his resistance entirely. Bernard reportedly framed his appeal as a vision of Christ asking Conrad on the day of judgment to account for what he had done with the gifts and power God had given him. Conrad wept. He took the cross. It was by any measure one of the more consequential acts of rhetorical manipulation in medieval history, and Bernard would spend years afterward trying to explain why the crusade he had preached with such confidence ended in complete disaster. Conrad led the German contingent overland through Anatolia in 1147, following roughly the same route the First Crusade had taken 50 years earlier. The First Crusade had won a decisive engagement at Dorylaeum in 1097, routing a Seljuk Turkish force and opening the Anatolian interior. In October 1147, near that same site, the Seljuks destroyed Conrad's army. The Turks had spent 50 years learning from the First Crusade, adapting their tactics, studying how Western knights fought and where their vulnerabilities lay. Conrad's forces marched into an environment they did not understand, with supply lines they could not protect, against an enemy that chose the ground and the moment. The battle was not a close thing. The Germans were ambushed, surrounded, and shattered. Conrad himself was wounded, reportedly twice, and retreated with the remnants of his force back to the Byzantine coast. He had lost the bulk of his army before reaching any Muslim-controlled territory. Rather than sail home, Conrad pressed on, eventually joining what remained of the crusading forces in the Holy Land and participating in the campaign's final act at Damascus in July 1148. The Siege of Damascus is one of the most studied disasters in medieval military history because its failure was apparently self-inflicted. The Crusaders began the siege in a position with access to water and orchards, a defensible and logistically viable spot. Then, under circumstances that contemporary sources record but cannot fully explain, the army abandoned that position and moved to an exposed approach with no water and no shade in the July heat of Syria. A Zengid relief force was approaching. The siege collapsed in 4 days, from July 24th to July 28th. Historians have proposed local political interference, distrust between the newly arrived Crusaders and the native Frankish settlers, who had their own reasons to avoid permanently alienating Damascus, and the possibility of bribery, though none of these explanations is definitively supported by the sources. Conrad returned to Germany in the autumn of 1148. Bernard of Clairvaux, faced with the collective outrage of a Christendom that had been promised divine assistance and received catastrophic failure, wrote his treatise De Consideratione partly as an attempt to explain how God could have allowed a crusade preached by saints to end this way. His answer broadly was that the sins of the Crusaders had made them unworthy of victory. It was a theologically convenient explanation, and one that did nothing to restore Edessa. Conrad's legend in the Second Crusade is the legend of someone who showed up when he did not have to, fought through a disaster that was not entirely his making, and endured the kind of failure that attaches itself to a man's name permanently. He had done what Bernard asked. It simply did not work. Richard I of England. Richard I of England is probably the most famous crusader who ever lived, a reputation constructed almost entirely on a campaign that failed to accomplish its stated objective. The Third Crusade was launched because Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, and the most formidable Islamic military commander of the 12th century, captured Jerusalem on October 2nd, 1187, after defeating the Crusader army at the catastrophic Battle of Hattin. The loss of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through Europe that dwarfed even the fall of Edessa 40 years earlier, and it produced what historians regard as the most organized and well-resourced crusading effort of the entire era. 3 kings responded: Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip II of France, and Richard I of England. Frederick drowned crossing a river in Anatolia in June 1190 before reaching the Holy Land, removing the most experienced of the 3 from the equation entirely. Philip arrived, stayed long enough to participate in the siege of Acre, and went home citing illness and political pressures in France. Richard stayed, fought, and made himself immortal. He arrived at Acre in June 1191, and the city fell to the combined Crusader force on July 12th after a siege that had already been grinding on for nearly 2 years before his arrival. What followed that victory was the act that has shadowed Richard's reputation ever since: Approximately 2,700 Muslim prisoners taken at Acre were executed on August 20th, 1191, at a site near the city in full view of Saladin's army. Richard's stated justification was that negotiations over a prisoner exchange had stalled, and that the army could not continue its march south while responsible for thousands of captives. The massacre is recorded in both Christian and Muslim sources, including the account of Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, Saladin's personal biographer and a man who was present with the Muslim army, which gives it a corroboration that makes denial impossible. Saladin responded by killing his own Christian prisoners. The march south along the coast toward Jaffa became one of the most tactically remarkable sustained operations of the crusading era. Richard kept his army in tight formation, the infantry on the landward side absorbing relentless harassment from Saladin's mounted archers, the cavalry preserved behind them for the decisive moment, the fleet paralleling the march just offshore, providing supply and a psychological anchor. At Arsuf on September 7th, 1191, Saladin committed his forces to a major engagement. The battle that followed demonstrated exactly what Richard could do when conditions allowed it. The Crusaders held their formation under assault until the moment Richard chose, then unleashed a coordinated cavalry charge that broke the Ayyubid line and sent Saladin's forces into retreat. It was a near-perfect execution of a medieval combined arms battle, and it cemented Richard's reputation as a tactician of the First Order. Then came the decisions that haunt the campaign. Richard advanced toward Jerusalem, came within sight of the city twice, and twice withdrew without attacking. The first withdrawal in January 1192 was justified on strategic grounds that historians have largely accepted. A siege of Jerusalem would have required an enormous force to hold the surrounding territory. Muslim Egypt could resupply the city faster than the Crusaders could capture it, and even if taken, Jerusalem could not be defended without a substantial permanent garrison that the Crusaders simply did not have. The second withdrawal in June 1192 produced the same assessment. The logic was militarily sound. The psychological damage to the crusade was profound. Men had marched from Europe to see Jerusalem. Their commander had looked at it and turned around twice. Richard's interactions with Saladin during this period, conducted through intermediaries including Richard's own brother-in-law and Saladin's brother Aladil, produced some of the most remarkable exchanges of the crusading era. Saladin sent ice and fresh fruit when Richard fell ill with fever. Richard proposed a marriage between his sister Joan and Aladil that would theoretically create a joint Christian-Muslim rule over Jerusalem. Neither proposal went anywhere, but they illustrate that both men understood each other as something beyond simple enemies. The critical question of whether they ever met in person is almost certainly answered no by historians, despite the frequency with which later literature depicts their meetings. The Treaty of Jaffa, signed on September 2nd, 1192, ended the campaign. Christian pilgrims gained access to Jerusalem. The Crusaders kept the coastal strip they had reconquered. The city remained under Muslim control. Richard sailed for home and was captured in December 1192 near Vienna by Duke Leopold of Austria, against whom he had made an enemy at Acre by tearing down his banner. The ransom required to free him was 150,000 marks, a figure so enormous that contemporary chroniclers struggled to contextualize it. England was stripped of silver to pay it. Richard went home, fought wars in France, and died in 1199 from a crossbow wound at a minor siege. He had spent approximately 6 months of his 10-year reign in England. The legend was complete before he was 40. Enrico Dandolo. Enrico Dandolo was somewhere between 80 and 95 years old, nearly completely blind, and the Doge of Venice when he personally took the Crusader's cross and redirected the Fourth Crusade to produce the single most profitable act of Christian-on-Christian violence in medieval history. The Fourth Crusade was supposed to attack Egypt, the strategic heart of Muslim power in the region, following the strategic logic that had animated the Fifth Crusade before it was launched. The crusading army that gathered in 1202 was substantial, enthusiastic, and completely unable to pay its bills. The leadership had contracted with Venice to provide transport for 33,500 men and supplies for a year, at a cost of 85,000 silver marks. When the army assembled on the Venetian island of Lido, it became apparent that the actual numbers fell significantly short of the contracted figures, and the Crusaders could pay only about 51,000 marks. Venice had fulfilled its side of the contract, building or acquiring the necessary ships at enormous cost to the Republic, and was not interested in absorbing the difference. Dandolo proposed an alternative. The city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast had recently defected from Venetian to Hungarian control. Help Venice retake it, Dandolo suggested, and the debt would be renegotiated. Zara was a Christian city. Its inhabitants reportedly hung crosses on the city walls when the Crusade fleet appeared, a desperate appeal to crusading solidarity. It made no difference. The Crusade sacked Zara in November 1202. Pope Innocent III, who had been issuing increasingly stern warnings about the Crusade's direction, excommunicated the entire enterprise. Then, faced with the practical reality that his crusade had been destroyed before reaching any Muslim territory and recognizing that Dandolo was the only person with the organizational capacity to keep it functional, quietly lifted the excommunication. The moral framework of the crusade had been established. It would go where Dandolo steered it. The arrival of the Byzantine prince Alexius Angelus, who had escaped from Constantinople after his father was deposed, provided the next pivot. Alexius promised staggering rewards if the crusade would help him retake the Byzantine throne. 200,000 silver marks, unity of the Greek and Latin churches, and crusade support thereafter. Dandolo saw the opportunity and took it. Godfrey of Villehardouin, the Marshal of Champagne and one of the Crusade's leaders, wrote an eyewitness account of what followed that remains the most important primary source for the Fourth Crusade. He describes Dandolo at the initial assault on Constantinople's sea walls in July 1203, standing at the prow of his own galley, the banner of Saint Mark in front of him, an old blind man ordering his ship to beach itself directly under the walls while other vessels hung back. It worked. The psychological impact of the Doge's personal example, whatever its precise military contribution, drove the Venetian galleys onto the shore and the assault forward. Constantinople fell briefly, Alexios was installed, and then everything collapsed. Alexios IV could not deliver the rewards he had promised. He was murdered in a palace coup in January 1204. The promises evaporated. The Crusade leaders, now stuck in Constantinople with no money, no objective, and no way home, made the decision that permanently altered Byzantine civilization. In March 1204, before a single wall had been breached, Dandolo and the Crusade leaders signed the Partition of Romania, a document that divided the Byzantine Empire among the Crusaders and Venice on paper. They then conquered it. Constantinople was sacked beginning April 12th, 1204. 3 days of looting destroyed, scattered, or transferred to the west centuries of accumulated Byzantine art, manuscripts, religious relics, and wealth. The horses of St. Mark, the 4 bronze horses that still stand, in replica form above the entrance to the Basilica of San Marco in Venice, were taken from the Hippodrome of Constantinople during this sack. Dandolo did not return to Venice. He died in Constantinople in 1205 and was buried, according to widely cited tradition, in the Hagia Sophia itself, the supreme architectural expression of Byzantine Christianity. An old, blind, excommunicated doge entombed in the holiest church of the civilization he had destroyed. The Fourth Crusade had reached its logical conclusion. Cardinal Pelagius of Albano came within approximately 1 month of winning the Fifth Crusade and chose not to, twice, and then drowned it in the Nile. The Fifth Crusade, launched in 1217, built on the strategic insight of the Fourth Lateran Council that Egypt was the key to the Holy Land. Control the Nile Delta, take Cairo, and the Islamic world's ability to resupply and reinforce Palestine would collapse. The Crusade assembled a genuinely formidable force with contingents from Hungary, Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, and several Italian city-states, and it chose Damietta, the fortified city commanding the mouth of the Nile's eastern branch, as its initial objective. The siege of Damietta lasted from May 1218 to November 1219, 16 brutal months of disease, flooding, heat, and grinding attrition. A significant breakthrough came when Frisian and German sailors, using specially constructed ships fitted with elevated fighting platforms, managed to capture the great chain tower that blocked the Nile at Damietta in August 1218, opening the river to Crusader shipping. Oliver of Paderborn, a scholar and preacher who was present throughout the campaign and wrote the Historia Damiettina, provides one of the most detailed accounts of the siege's progress. In the middle of this siege, in September 1219, a Franciscan friar named Francis of Assisi crossed the military lines under a flag of truce and presented himself to Sultan Al-Kamil of Egypt, asking to preach the Christian gospel. Al-Kamil, who was by multiple accounts an educated and genuinely curious man, received Francis with courtesy, listened to his preaching, and sent him safely back to the Crusader camp. Francis attempted to convert the Sultan. The Sultan was not converted, but the fact that a barefoot Italian friar could walk from one army to the other and have a theological conversation with the opposing commander while a siege was in progress says something about the specific quality of Al-Kamil that becomes important in what follows. Damietta fell on November 5th, 1219, when the Crusaders entered an effectively abandoned city. The garrison had collapsed from disease and starvation. It was a significant victory. Al-Kamil's response was extraordinary. He offered to return Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, the true cross captured at Hattin, and most of the Crusader kingdom of the 12th century in exchange for the Crusaders evacuating Egypt. The offer was, from the perspective of the Crusade's stated objectives, everything the Crusade had been launched to achieve. Pelagius refused. His reasons were strategic as well as theological. Jerusalem without defensible borders, he and the military orders argued, would be impossible to hold, and the momentum of the campaign favored pressing the attack on Cairo. Al-Kamil renewed the offer in 1220. Pelagius refused again. In July 1221, Pelagius overruled John of Brienne, the king of Jerusalem, who had direct knowledge of the Nile's seasonal behavior, and ordered the advance toward Cairo to begin. The Nile floods annually, with waters rising dramatically between July and September, transforming the delta's canal network from navigable channels into obstacles and turning the low-lying ground around them into marshes. The Crusader army advanced into this landscape in the Egyptian summer. Within weeks, the water was rising, the ground was softening. Al-Kamil had opened upstream sluices to accelerate the flooding, and an Egyptian fleet had slipped downstream to cut off retreat. The army that had refused Jerusalem twice was trapped in a marsh and surrendered in August 1221 without having fought a single pitched battle in the Nile advance. Al-Kamil's peace terms were again extraordinarily generous. He released the entire crusading army in exchange for Damietta and an 8-year truce. He returned prisoners. He provided food to men who were starving in the marshes before the surrender was even formalized. Pelagius returned to Europe. The chance to recover Jerusalem through negotiation had been offered and refused. The chance to take Cairo by force had dissolved in floodwater. The Fifth Crusade was over, and it had failed entirely on the decisions of one man, Frederick II. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Sicily, King of Jerusalem by right of his deceased wife, and active excommunicate of the Catholic Church, sailed to the Holy Land in 1228 and gave Jerusalem back to Christendom without killing anyone significant, then watched in something that must have resembled grim satisfaction as the Pope and the Patriarch of Jerusalem condemned him for it. Frederick's crusade is the strangest in the entire sequence, a diplomatic achievement so successful it was treated as a scandal. Frederick had promised to go on crusade repeatedly over years, and repeatedly delayed, citing the genuine political instability of his empire and the complexity of his Italian territories. Pope Gregory IX excommunicated him in September 1227, when illness caused yet another delay. Frederick sailed in June 1228, while still technically excommunicated, which meant that every church in the Holy Land that he entered could be placed under interdict, that no crusading indulgence could be granted to the men who marched with him, and that the Pope was simultaneously organizing a military campaign against Frederick's Italian territories, while Frederick was theoretically fighting for Christendom. The Crusade of the Excommunicate, as it became known, was canonically absurd. It was also successful in a way none of the others had been since 1099. Frederick had grown up in the Norman Arab Byzantine synthesis culture of Sicily, the most cosmopolitan court in 12th century Europe, where Arabic was spoken alongside Latin and Greek, where Muslim scholars served the royal administration, and where Islamic science, philosophy, and poetry were studied as matters of genuine intellectual interest rather than enemy propaganda. He had been in correspondence with Sultan Al-Kamil, who was the same ruler who had offered Jerusalem to Pelagius and been refused, and who had been continuing that negotiation through diplomatic back channels for years. The two men had exchanged philosophical questions, mathematical puzzles, and gifts. When Frederick arrived in the Holy Land with a force too small to wage serious war, he did not pretend otherwise. He negotiated. The Treaty of Jaffa, signed on February 18, 1229, returned Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, and a corridor connecting Jerusalem to the coast to Christian control, along with a 10-year truce. Muslims retained the Temple Mount with the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the city would be unfortified. Frederick got, through conversation and correspondence, what 5 previous crusades had collectively failed to win by force. The reaction was immediate and comprehensive outrage. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, Gerald of Lausanne, placed the city under interdict. The military orders refused to participate in the negotiations or acknowledge their results. In the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on March 18, 1229, Frederick conducted his own coronation as King of Jerusalem, placing the crown on his own head because no churchman would perform the ceremony. He then delivered a speech, reportedly in German and translated into French, that contemporary accounts suggest was a sophisticated defense of his methods that fell entirely on deaf ears. The crowd in Jerusalem, according to the hostile account of Philip of Navarre, pelted him with offal when he left the city to return to the coast, though this detail comes from a source deeply hostile to Frederick and should be treated with caution. Al-Kamil faced his own backlash. His subjects and political allies were horrified that Jerusalem had been surrendered at all, and he spent years managing the internal consequences of the treaty. The treaty expired in 1239, was briefly renewed by Frederick's diplomatic successors, and then in 1244 the Khwarezmian Turks, riding west under Mongol pressure, sacked Jerusalem, massacred its remaining Christian inhabitants, and ended the Christian presence in the the city permanently. Frederick's 10-year diplomatic solution, sneered at by the crusading establishment, turned out to have been the last time a Christian power held Jerusalem until the 20th century. Louis IX of France, 7th Crusade. Louis IX of France decided to go on crusade while lying in what he believed was his deathbed, and when he recovered and his mother tried to convince him that a vow made by a delirious man had no binding force, he thanked her for her concern and renewed the vow in full health. The Seventh Crusade was not a political calculation. It was a personal obligation between Louis and God, and he pursued it with the same systematic thoroughness he applied to everything else in his reign. 4 years of preparation followed the vow. Taken in 1244, Louis built the port of Aigues-Mortes on the Mediterranean coast specifically to serve as the embarkation point for his fleet, since France lacked a suitable Mediterranean harbor for an operation of this scale. He stocked the island of Cyprus with supplies for years in advance. He negotiated diplomatically across Europe and dispatched envoys to the Mongol court seeking the coordinated alliance against the Muslim powers that Crusade strategists had been theorizing about for decades. He also dispatched the Dominican friar William of Rubruck on an embassy to the Great Khan, producing one of the most remarkable travel accounts of the medieval period, though the military alliance never materialized. The fleet sailed in 1248 and landed in Egypt in June 1249. What followed at Damietta was almost shockingly easy. The Egyptian garrison abandoned the city overnight, and Louis's forces marched in on June 6, 1249, taking in hours what the Fifth Crusade had spent 16 months besieging. Then the Nile flood season began. The army waited at Damietta through the summer and autumn of 1249, an enforced delay that gave the Egyptians time to prepare defenses upstream and gave disease time to work through the Crusader camp. The advance toward Cairo began in November 1249. John of Joinville, Louis's companion, Seneschal of Champagne, and eventual biographer, was present throughout the campaign, and his Life of St. Louis is the most vivid and human account of any crusade in existence. Joinville describes the canal crossings, the skirmishes, the heat, the smell of the dead, and Louis's personal behavior under pressure in detail, so specific that reading it produces something close to the physical sensation of being present. The army became entangled in the canal network of the Nile Delta in exactly the way the Fifth Crusade's army had, the same geography, the same tactical problem, and roughly the same result. On April 6, 1250, at the Battle of Ferisker, the crusade collapsed. The army was surrounded, disease-ravaged, and cut off. Louis himself was captured. Joinville records that the king was suffering from dysentery so severely during the battle and surrender that his condition required the cutting away of his garments in the field, a detail that Joinville includes without editorializing, as simply a fact of what happened to a man who refused to stop fighting even when his body was failing completely. Louis negotiated his own release and the release of his army from captivity, doing so while ill in a foreign language through interpreters, with Egyptian emirs who had no particular reason to be generous. He paid a substantial ransom and surrendered Damietta. Then, instead of going home, he stayed in the Holy Land for 4 more years. From 1250 to 1254, Louis used his personal funds, his political connections, and the residual authority of a French king to fortify the coastal cities that remained in Crusader hands: Caesarea, Jaffa, Sidon, and Acre, negotiated the release of remaining Christian prisoners, and treated the battered settler community of the Crusader states as his personal responsibility. Joinville describes Louis distributing alms to lepers, weeping openly over the bodies of dead Crusaders at Ferisker, and conducting his morning prayers in the field before battle with the same discipline he applied to royal audiences. Whether these scenes are precise history or pious enhancement by a biographer who loved his subject, they defined how Western Christendom remembered him. He returned to France in 1254. He was canonized in 1297, becoming St. Louis, the only Crusader king whose crusading itself was part of the formal case for sainthood. He was not done yet. Louis IX of France, 8th Crusade. Louis IX of France took the cross for the second time in March 1267, 23 years after his first vow and 17 years after his capture in Egypt. He was 53 years old, in declining health, ruling a stable and prosperous kingdom, and had no pressing political reason to go anywhere near the Holy Land. He went anyway. The question of why has occupied historians for centuries. The devout interpretation is straightforward. Louis believed he had failed God, and the crusading ideal in Egypt and Tunis represented a second chance he was obligated to take. The more structurally analytical interpretation notes that Louis's Second Crusade was directed not at Egypt or Palestine, but at Tunis, a decision that has generated significant scholarly debate. The stated justification was that the Hafsid Emir of Tunis, Muhammad I al-Mustansir, was said to be considering conversion to Christianity, and that a crusade to Tunis might win a new Christian ally on the North African coast. This explanation was treated skeptically even by contemporaries. Louis's brother Charles of Anjou had recently become king of Sicily and had significant commercial and financial relationships with Tunis, including debts owed to him that Tunis had been slow to pay. Whether Charles shaped the campaign's strategic direction for personal financial reasons remains debated among historians, but the question has never been fully resolved. The Crusade fleet sailed from Aigues-Mortes and landed near Carthage on the North African coast in July 1270. The ancient ruins of Carthage were visible from the camp. The campaign stopped almost immediately. The summer heat of North Africa hit a northern European army that was not acclimatized to it, and disease moved through the camp within days of landing. Typhoid or dysentery, sources are not entirely consistent on the specifics, killed men at an accelerating rate throughout July and into August. Louis fell ill. He had been ill before on Crusade and had fought through it. This time was different. He died in his tent outside Carthage on August 25, 1270, having captured no city, won no battle, and not yet reached any Muslim-controlled territory that had been specifically identified as a crusading objective. Later, hagiographic tradition holds that his last word was Jerusalem, which is the kind of detail that becomes attached to saints' deaths regardless of whether it happened. Charles of Anjou arrived with his Sicilian fleet after Louis had died, took command of the crusade, and within weeks had negotiated a peace with Tunis that included favorable commercial terms for Sicily and a resumption of Tunis's tribute payments, which was precisely the financial arrangement that critics had suspected was the real objective all along. The crusade that Louis had launched in sincere pursuit of something he believed God required of him was concluded, after his death, as a Sicilian trade deal. The English contingent under Prince Edward arrived to find the campaign already over, the peace already signed, and the fleet preparing to go home. Edward continued east to the Holy Land, where his activities became the Ninth Crusade, carrying the justification of Louis's name and example with him across the Mediterranean. Louis's body was processed according to the medieval custom for royal deaths abroad. His flesh was boiled from his bones at Carthage, and his skeleton was returned to France for burial at the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the traditional resting place of French kings. He was canonized 27 years later by Pope Boniface VIII. The crusading ideal in the generation after Louis became increasingly entangled with his memory. The last king who had gone not for strategy or politics or commercial advantage, but because he genuinely believed he had to, Prince Edward of England. Prince Edward of England arrived in the Holy Land in May 1271 at the head of approximately 1,000 knights, a force so small by crusading standards that contemporaries noted it represented the genuine limits of what Western Europe was willing to commit to the crusading project at this point in history. The Ninth Crusade, if it can be called that, was less a crusade in the traditional sense than a prolonged military presence by a single determined man who refused to acknowledge that the era was essentially over. The Crusader states in 1271 were a shadow of what they had been a century earlier. The great castles of the interior had fallen one by one to the Mamluk Sultan Baybars, who was arguably the most capable military administrator the Islamic world produced in the 13th century. Baybars had taken Caesarea in 1265, Arsuf in 1265, Safed in 1266, Jaffa and Beaufort in 1268, and Antioch, the great city of the First Crusade, in 1268 as well, killing or enslaving its entire population in an act that shocked even the violence-accustomed political culture of the 13th century. What remained of the Crusader presence was essentially Acre and a handful of coastal towns, increasingly dependent on Italian merchant fleets for their connection to Europe. Edward arrived into this environment and immediately attempted to construct the strategic framework that crusade planners had been theorizing about for 50 years. A coordinated campaign between the Western Crusaders and the Mongol Ilkhanate of Persia, whose rulers had been converting toward Christianity and who had their own reasons to oppose Mamluk power in Syria. The Ilkhan Abbasa responded positively and launched a Mongol raid into Syria in late 1271, reaching as far as the Euphrates. It was not large enough to be decisive, and it was not coordinated closely enough with Edward's movements to create the kind of two-front pressure that could have threatened Baybars seriously. The grand alliance between Latin Christendom and the Mongol East, which had been the great hope of crusade strategists since the time of Louis IX, never came together into anything more than a raid and a diplomatic correspondence. Edward conducted a series of raids and skirmishes in the region around Acre during 1271 and 1272, including the capture of the small castle of Kakun, none of which significantly altered the military balance or threatened Baybars' control of the interior. career. The Mamluk Sultan, who had been watching crusading expeditions arrive and depart for years, appeared largely unconcerned. What Edward could not accomplish militarily, he pursued diplomatically, and in May 1272 he negotiated a 10-year truce with Baybars, extending the Crusader presence by a decade in exchange for abandoning active campaigning. Then, in June 1272, an assassin agent gained access to Edward's quarters in Acre, posing, according to various accounts, as a local convert or a trusted messenger, and stabbed him with a small dagger that was either poisoned or not, depending on which source one reads. Edward fought off the attacker himself, killing him, and survived. The wound required weeks of recovery and left him weakened. The story that attached itself to this episode almost immediately was that Edward's wife Eleanor of Castile, who was with him in Acre, sucked the poison from the wound, saving his life through an act of wifely devotion that later generations found irresistibly romantic. Virtually every modern historian who has examined the sources concludes that this almost certainly did not happen, that it appears in chronicles written well after the event, and that it belongs to the category of legend that accretes around historical figures who became famous for other reasons. Edward left the Holy Land in September 1272. Somewhere in the Mediterranean on his way home, he received news that his father Henry III had died on November 16th, 1272, making him King of England. He did not rush. He traveled through Sicily, visited Pope Gregory X at Orvieto, attended a tournament in Burgundy, and arrived in England in August 1274, nearly 2 years after his accession. It was a deliberate statement about his confidence in his own authority, the behavior of a man who knew that no one was going to give his kingdom away while he was traveling. The Crusader states survived until 1291. Acre, the last significant city, fell to the Mamluks on May 18th, 1291, with a massacre of its defenders and population. Edward was King of England by then, fighting wars in Wales and Scotland, occasionally discussing new crusades in diplomatic contexts without ever launching one. The era that had begun when Godfrey of Bouillon sold his castle and marched east in 1096 ended with the walls of Acre going down, and the last man who had genuinely gone and come back was ruling a kingdom at the other end of Europe, having turned the assassination attempt, the poisoned dagger, and the dying woman outside Carthage into something that looked, from the distance of history, like the final chapter of the longest and strangest military adventure the medieval world produced. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.